The Grand Convocation Hall was built to make visitors feel small. Its ceiling rose so high that clouds of vapor sometimes formed near the top, drifting between the lights like tiny ghosts. The seats curved upward in a great bowl, hundreds of alien delegations looking down at whoever stood in the center. It was designed this way on purpose. The species that sat highest felt powerful. The species that sat lowest understood their place. Ambassador Yuna sat at the lowest table. She had been sitting there for 11 months. 11 months of talks that went nowhere. 11 months of smiling at creatures who looked at her the way a person might look at a dog that had learned to speak. Impressed, perhaps, but not enough to take it seriously. She kept her hands folded on the table. Her datapad was open in front of her. Dr. Unji sat to her left, quiet as always, reviewing notes that had nothing to do with diplomacy and everything to do with weapons engineering. Two junior aides sat behind them, still and professional. High Speaker Valmari stood at his podium above them all. He was old, even by the standards of his species. His 6 limbs moved slowly, deliberately, as if every gesture was a ceremony. His voice carried easily through the hall, without any amplification. It was the kind of voice that expected obedience. "The Council has deliberated with great patience," Valmari said. "We recognize that the Terran delegation has endured a long process. We wish to bring this matter to a close, with terms that reflect both justice and generosity." Yuna did not react. She had heard the word generosity from Valmari before. It never meant what it was supposed to mean. Valmari gestured, and a holographic display appeared at the center of the hall. The terms of the peace agreement floated in blue light for everyone to see. Yuna read them. Her face did not change, but under the table, her left hand pressed flat against her knee. Humanity was to surrender 12 colony worlds along the outer border. These were worlds that humans had found, settled, and built from bare rock over 3 generations. 60% of the Terran fleet was to be decommissioned and scrapped under Council supervision. Council patrol ships would be granted unlimited access to the Sol system itself, Earth's home system, the cradle of the species. In return, humanity would receive provisional membership in the Galactic Council, with no voting rights for 200 standard years. 200 years. Yuna almost smiled at that. Humans did not live for 200 years. The Council was offering rights that no living human would ever use. Delegate Thren of the Oshari Dominion leaned forward in his seat, 3 rows above the floor. He was broad, covered in thick gray plates that served as both skin and armor. His species had conquered 6 others before joining the Council, and he had never let anyone forget it. "The humans should consider themselves fortunate," Thren said, his voice like gravel sliding down a metal chute. "When the Oshari absorbed the Maliki, there were no talks. When we pacified the Fen, there was no table to sit at. The Council is offering you a seat, a low seat, yes, but a seat. Most species in your position do not get to sit at all." Several delegates in the upper rows nodded. Delegate Pira of the Keloni Federation, a thin and nervous creature who always voted with the majority, tapped her approval on their console without even looking at the terms. The hall waited. Every eye and sensor turned to the human table. Yuna looked at Dr. Yunji. Yunji met her gaze and gave the smallest nod, so small that no alien in the room would have caught it. But Yuna understood. It meant we are ready for whatever comes next. She did it slowly, pushing her chair back without scraping the floor. She picked up her datapad and placed it neatly on top of the stack of documents and folders that had accumulated over 11 months of useless negotiation. She straightened the stack, so the edges were perfectly aligned. "I would like to confirm," Yuna said, her voice clear and even, "that these terms are final, that the Council considers this its last and best offer." Volmari tilted his great head. They are final. And there is no willingness to negotiate further? The council does not negotiate with provisional members, Volmari said. There was a ripple of quiet agreement from the upper rows. Yuna nodded. She looked around the hall one last time. She looked at Thren, who was smiling. She looked at Pyrrha, who was already checking other messages on her console. She looked at the hundreds of alien faces staring down at her, with boredom and mild contempt. Then we have nothing further to discuss, Yuna said. Humanity withdraws from these proceedings, effective immediately. She picked up the stack of documents and walked toward the exit. She did not rush. She did not look back. Dr. Unji stood and followed. The two aides followed after that. Their footsteps echoed in the sudden silence of the hall. Steady, unhurried, final. The doors closed behind them with a soft sound. Not a slam. Just a click. For 3 full seconds, nobody in the convocation hall moved. Then the noise began. Delegates turned to each other. Voices rose. Volmari struck his podium for order. Thren was laughing, a deep rumbling sound, shaking his head, as if he had just watched a child throw a tantrum. Let them go, Thren said loudly enough for the whole chamber to hear. They will be back within a month. Where else will they go? Pyrrha looked less certain. She turned to the delegate beside her. They cannot simply leave, can they? No one has ever simply left. In the far corner of the hall, in an alcove so dim that most delegates forgot it existed, Archivist Sula sat surrounded by files and screens. She was small, even for her species. Her job was to record everything, and advise no one unless asked. She was almost never asked. She had watched Yuna's face as the ambassador read the terms. She had watched the way Yuna's hand pressed against her knee. She had watched the way the humans left. No anger, no raised voices, no promises of revenge. Sula pulled up a file on her screen. It was labeled Species 4471, Human, Full Assessment. It was over 2,000 pages long. According to the access log, it had been opened by council leadership exactly once, and only the first 3 pages had been read. Sula whispered to herself in the dim light of her alcove. They did not slam the door. They closed it quietly. She looked at the access log again. That is so much worse. The emergency session began 6 hours after the humans left. The convocation hall was louder than it had been in decades. Delegates shouted over each other. Aides ran between seats carrying messages. Volmari struck his podium again and again, but order came slowly and did not last. The general opinion, shared by nearly every delegation, was simple. The humans were bluffing. They were a young species, barely 500 years into space travel. They had fought a border war with the Council for 3 years, and had held their ground, yes. But holding ground and winning were very different things. They would realize, in the cold silence of their own territory, that they had no real options. They would come back. They would accept the terms. This was how the galaxy worked. Thren was the loudest voice in the room, as always. He stood at his delegation's platform and spoke as if he were already planning a victory parade. I say we give them 30 days, Thren announced. If they have not returned to this table in 30 days, the Council should authorize military action. A short campaign. The Oshari will lead, of course. We have experience in these matters. He tapped a control on his console, and a holographic map of Terran space appeared in the center of the hall. Oshari fleet projections drew bright lines through human territory, arrows pointing toward Earth. 6 months to reach their homeworld. 1 year to pacify the colonies. We have done this before with larger empires than theirs. Several delegates murmured approval. The numbers looked clean. The arrows looked confident. At the back of the hall, Archivist Sula raised her hand. It took several minutes for anyone to notice. When Volmari finally acknowledged her, it was with the tired patience of someone listening to a child ask a question during an adult conversation. The archivist may speak, Volmari said, briefly. Sula walked to the center of the hall. She carried a single datapad, though the files stored on it were enormous. She stood where Yuna had stood hours before, in the lowest point of the room, and looked up at the rows of delegates who stared down at her with mild irritation. I would like to present several items from the full intelligence assessment on humanity, Sula said. Items that I believe are relevant to any discussion of military action. We have all reviewed the assessment, Thren said dismissively. The access log shows that Council leadership opened the file once, Sula replied calmly. 3 pages were viewed. The file is 2,047 pages long. Volmari gestured for her to continue. Sula began. She spoke in the flat, careful tone of someone who had spent years organizing information that no one wanted to hear. First, she explained human governance. The Council assumed that humanity had a single government that could be pressured, threatened, or overthrown. In reality, humans operated through dozens of competing nations, corporations, and independent colonial authorities. They argued constantly among themselves. They disagreed about nearly everything. But when threatened from outside, these fractured groups unified with a speed that no council model could predict or explain. It was as if conflict was a signal that activated something deep and ancient in their species. Second, she described human ships. Council analysts had rated human vessels as crude, heavy, blocky, over-engineered. What the analysts had failed to understand was that humans built their ships to absorb punishment that would destroy Council designs. Where the Council used elegant shields and precise energy weapons, humans used thick armor plating and projectile weapons that fired chunks of metal at incredible speeds. Their ships were not beautiful. They were not efficient. They were built by a species that expected the universe to try to kill them, and had decided to make that as difficult as possible. Third, and here Sula paused, because this was the part that frightened her most. She talked about human history. She pulled up a single data point that she had flagged in the original assessment. A point that had been on page 47, well past where anyone had stopped reading. Humans had invented nuclear weapons before they invented space travel. A few delegates shifted uncomfortably. They split the atom, Sula said, and the first thing they did with that knowledge was build a bomb. They used it on their own kind, on their own planet. They did this before they had even left their world's atmosphere. This is not a species that hesitates to escalate. Thren waved a limb dismissively. Ancient history. It does not change the military calculus. Sula looked at him. During 3 years of border warfare, she said, humanity deployed an estimated 15% of their total fleet capacity. The hall went quiet again, but differently this time. 15%, Sula repeated. The forces that held our combined fleet to a standstill for 3 years were their border patrols. Their reserves have never been activated. We do not have reliable estimates of their full military strength because they have never shown it. Are you suggesting that our intelligence is incomplete? I am suggesting that our intelligence has been available and complete for years, Sula said. No one read it. Thren made a sound of disgust and turned away. Pyrrha stared at her console, her thin fingers tapping nervously. Volmari thanked Sula with a polite phrase that meant the discussion was over, and the matter would be tabled. Sula returned to her alcove. She did not argue further. She had done what she could. Far from the Nexus station, deep in the space between stars, the Terran flagship Guangato cut through emptiness at speeds the Council's fastest scouts could not match. Admiral Tejo stood in his private briefing room, waiting. When Ambassador Yuna arrived, still wearing her diplomatic clothes, he offered her a chair and a cup of tea. She took both. The talks were never real, Yuna said. It was not a question. No, Tejo agreed. The talks were just a polite way of asking for it. Yuna held the tea with both hands and stared at the dark viewport. Stars slid past in thin white lines. Then, we do what we planned. Tejo nodded. He opened a sealed file on his personal console. It was marked with a single designation, Directive 7. He read it once, though he had already memorized every word, and then called Captain Dohan to the bridge. Dohan arrived within 2 minutes, his uniform sharp, his face showing nothing. He was the kind of officer who did not ask unnecessary questions. "Send the activation signal," Tejo said. "All fleet commands, all reserve stations, all colonial defense networks." Dohan did not hesitate. "What is the message, sir?" Tejo looked out the viewport at the passing stars. Somewhere behind them, the council was laughing at a species that had walked away from a negotiation table. Somewhere ahead of them, 4,000 warships sat in cold dock, waiting for a signal that had not been sent in the entire history of the Terran Navy. "Wake them all up," Tejo said. Down the corridor, in a laboratory that hummed with energy, Dr. Unji was already running projections. She told Tejo through the intercom that full mobilization would take 90 days. Tejo replied that they would not need 90. Unji paused for a moment, then returned to her work without asking why. She already knew the answer. She had built it herself. On the 14th day after the walkout, every human diplomatic channel in the galaxy went silent. It did not happen gradually. It happened all at once, like a light being switched off. Embassies closed. Communication relays stopped responding. Trade beacons went dark. The border between Terran space and the rest of the galaxy became a wall of nothing. No signals coming out. No signals going in. The merchant vessels noticed first. Hundreds of alien cargo ships that used human trade routes as shortcuts through the galaxy found themselves being met at the border by Terran Navy escorts. The escorts were polite. They were professional. They told the merchants in calm and simple language that Terran space was closed to all non-human traffic until further notice. Any cargo currently in transit would be delivered to the nearest border station. Personal belongings would be returned. No property would be seized. "You are welcome to return when the situation changes," the Terran officers said, the same phrase every time, as if reading from a script. And then they guided the alien ships to the edge of human space and watched them leave. Within 3 weeks, the economic damage was beyond anything the Council had predicted, because the Council had never bothered to calculate how much of the galactic economy depended on humanity. The answer, it turned out, was far more than anyone was comfortable admitting. Human-built FTL relay stations handled nearly a third of all interstellar communication traffic. Human-designed cargo haulers were the standard for long-range transport. Human-refined fuel was cheaper and more efficient than anything the Council produced. All of it was gone overnight. 12 Council species reported supply chain failures in the first month. The Keloni Federation, whose economy depended heavily on trade, lost 30% of its shipping capacity. Delegate Pira sent frantic messages to Valmari, begging him to reopen negotiations. Valmari refused. Sending an envoy to the humans now, he said, would be an admission that the Council needed them. The Council did not need anyone. He sent messages anyway, through back channels, phrased as diplomatic courtesies rather than requests. Every message to Terran space received the same reply. A single word, transmitted without delay, without emotion, without any opening for further conversation. Noted. That was all. Just noted. The Council's most eloquent diplomats crafted careful messages full of subtle language and implied offers. The response was always the same. One word. It was, several delegates admitted privately, the most unsettling thing they had ever encountered. They could have handled threats. The silence was something else entirely. Thren, meanwhile, pushed harder for military action. He brought new fleet projections to every session. He argued that each day of delay made humanity stronger and the Council weaker. He demanded a vote. But his own intelligence officers were growing nervous. Oshari scouts, the best in the galaxy, had been sent to probe the edges of Terran space. What they found, or rather, what they did not find, made them uneasy. The border systems were empty. Not just quiet, empty. The patrol stations that humanity had maintained for years were gone, dismantled or moved. The defensive satellites were offline. The minefields that had made the borders so costly during the war had been cleared. There was nothing there, just open space, star after star, system after system, with no sign of human presence. One Oshari scout commander, a veteran of 40 years, filed a report that was largely ignored. In the report, he noted that the empty border could be interpreted two ways. It could mean retreat, that the humans had pulled back to defend their core systems, abandoning the frontier. This was the interpretation that Thren preferred. But the commander offered a second interpretation. He wrote that the border looked exactly like what a military strategist would create if they wanted a clear and unobstructed firing lane. A wide-open corridor through which a massive fleet could move at full speed without hitting anything. He recommended extreme caution. The report was filed. It was not read by anyone in leadership. Sula read it, because Sula read everything. She had spent the past weeks buried in human history, and what she found kept her awake during the hours when she should have been resting. She compiled a private report, not for the Council. She had learned that the Council did not listen to her, but for Valmari alone. The report focused on how humans fought wars, not their technology, not their ships, not their numbers, but their philosophy of conflict. And the philosophy was terrifying in its simplicity. Humans did not fight to gain territory. They did not fight to collect resources or prestige. When pushed into a real war, a war they believed threatened their survival, humans fought to break things. They fought to make sure the enemy could never threaten them again. Their history was full of examples. Cities burned to the ground. Entire nations dismantled. Enemies not just defeated, but so thoroughly destroyed that they could not recover for generations. The concept of a proportional response existed in human thinking, Sula noted. They had philosophers and scholars who argued for restraint, for measured retaliation, and in small conflicts, they sometimes followed these principles. But when they believed their survival was at stake, they threw proportionality away like a broken tool. They escalated. They always escalated. They went further than anyone expected, every single time. Sula brought this report to Valmari in his private chambers. He read it while she stood in silence. She watched his 6 limbs go still, one by one, which was a sign of deep unease in his species. When he finished, he set the datapad down and looked at her. "Why were we not told this before the war began?" he asked. "You were," Sula said. "It was in the original assessment. Page 212 through 240. No one read it." Valmari said nothing for a long time. Then he dismissed her. Deep inside Terran space, far from any border, Sergeant Jiho led his platoon through a training exercise on a simulated alien world. The gravity was wrong. The air mix was wrong. The buildings were shaped in ways that made no sense to human eyes. Everything about the environment was designed to feel foreign and hostile. His soldiers moved through it anyway, clearing rooms, securing corridors, covering angles. They did not joke. They did not complain. They worked with the quiet focus of people who understood that what they were practicing would soon be real. After the exercise, Jiho stood outside the simulation building and looked up at the sky. It was artificial, a projected dome showing stars that were not really there. Somewhere beyond that dome, beyond the planet's atmosphere, beyond the system's edge, the largest fleet in human history was assembling. He had seen the numbers. Everyone in the military had. 4,000 warships, 60 carrier groups, and something else, something listed only by a project name, Hwarong, that nobody below admiral rank was allowed to ask about. Jiho did not know what Project Hwarong was. He did not need to know. He only needed to know that when the order came, he and his soldiers would do their jobs. He finished his water, crushed the container, and went back inside to run the exercise again. On the bridge of the Bwangato, Admiral Tejo stood in the dark and watched the fleet roster update on his screen. Green lights, one after another, as ships completed their preparation and reported ready. The numbers climbed steadily, like a heartbeat growing stronger. Dr. Unji appeared beside him, holding a thin datapad. "Hwarong is loaded and ready for deployment," she said. Her voice was the same as always, calm, pleasant, as if she were discussing the weather. Tejo looked at the datapad. He did not take it. "Has it been tested?" "Simulations only, but the math is sound." She paused. "It will work, Admiral. I wish it would not, but it will." Tejo nodded slowly. He turned back to the screen and its growing constellation of green lights. Outside the viewport, Terran space was quiet. The galaxy thought it was the silence of weakness, of a species retreating into its shell. It was not. It was the silence of something about to happen. Thren got his vote on a Tuesday, by Galactic Standard Time. The Council authorized what it called a police action against Terran border space. It was not called a war. Wars required formal declarations, legal processes, and political risk. A police action was quieter. It meant the Council could send its fleet, and if things went wrong, pretend it had never happened. 800 warships gathered at the Oshari forward base near the Kethrin Nebula. It was the largest combined fleet the Council had assembled in over a century. Oshari dreadnoughts formed the core, massive, gray, built for intimidation as much as combat. Around them, cruisers and escorts from 11 other species filled the formation. The fleet moved out, with Thren aboard his personal flagship, broadcasting confidence to every ship in the armada. They crossed into Terran space, expecting resistance at the first system. The system of Hanem 4, which had once been a thriving human colony of 200,000 people, was completely empty. The orbital stations were dark. The surface settlements were abandoned. Scans showed that the humans had taken everything: equipment, vehicles, personal belongings. Even the farming soil had been packed and shipped away. They had left nothing behind except empty buildings and silence. Thren declared the system captured and ordered the fleet to advance. The second system was the same, empty, quiet, not a single human ship, not a single active signal. The third system was identical. By the time they reached the fourth target, some of the non-Oshari commanders were growing uncomfortable. One Kaloni captain sent a message to his superiors, noting that the advance felt less like a conquest and more like walking into an open mouth. Thren ignored the concerns. He read the emptiness as retreat. Humanity pulling back to defend Earth, abandoning everything else. It was what weaker species did. He had seen it before. The fleet jumped to the Myrian corridor, a wide stretch of open space between two dense star clusters. It was the natural highway into the heart of Terran territory. Thren planned to use it as a staging area before the final push toward Sol. They arrived. Sensors swept the area. For a moment, the screens showed nothing but empty space and distant stars. Then every alarm on every ship in the fleet went off at the same time. They came from behind, from above, from below, from angles that the Council's tactical doctrine said were impossible to coordinate. 1,200 Terran warships dropped out of faster-than-light travel, in a perfect sphere around the Council armada. They had been waiting in deep space, engines cold, drifting in the dark like stones in a river, completely invisible to every scanner the Council possessed. The sphere closed. The Council fleet was surrounded on every axis. There was no escape vector, There was no direction to run that did not lead directly into the guns of a human warship. Admiral Tejo opened a single broadband communication channel. His voice reached every ship in the corridor, Council and Terran alike. He spoke slowly and clearly, the way a person speaks when they want to be understood the first time. This is Admiral Tejo of the United Terran Navy. You have entered sovereign Terran space under arms. You will power down your weapons and shields and await escort out of our territory. You have 60 seconds to comply. There will not be a second warning. Silence. Then Thren's voice roared across the fleet channel, ordering all ships to attack. Overwhelm the humans with firepower. Do not hesitate. Half the fleet obeyed. They fired weapons, raised shields, and charged toward the nearest gap in the human formation. The other half, the Keloni ships, the smaller delegations, the captains who had read the intelligence reports that Thren had not, hesitated. They sat still, engines idling, waiting to see what happened next. What happened next took 11 minutes. The Terran fleet did not fight the way the Council expected. Council warships were designed for energy weapon duels at long range. Elegant exchanges of fire, where shields absorbed damage, and the ship with the best technology won. The humans fought differently. Terran electronic warfare systems hit first, flooding Council sensors with so much false data that half the Oshari fleet lost target locks within the first 30 seconds. Captains who had been aiming at human ships suddenly found themselves shooting at phantom echoes while the real ships moved freely through the chaos. Then the kinetic weapons opened fire. The Council used energy beams. Humans used mass, dense slugs of metal, accelerated to terrifying velocities. Council shields were designed to disperse energy, not stop physical objects moving at a significant fraction of the speed of light. The slugs punched through shields like they were not there. Oshari dreadnoughts, the pride of the fleet, shuddered and broke apart as projectiles tore through their hulls. Captain Dowan coordinated the Guangeto's fighter wings from the tactical station, his voice flat and steady, calling targets and adjustments with the calm of someone directing traffic. Sergeant Jiho stood with his Marine squad in the launch bay, ready for boarding operations that never became necessary. The Council ships that fought were destroyed too quickly. When the 11 minutes ended, 300 Council warships were destroyed or disabled. Wreckage drifted through the Myrian corridor in a slowly expanding cloud of metal and frozen atmosphere. The remaining 500 ships had surrendered, their weapons powered down, their crews sitting in stunned silence. Human losses were 14 ships damaged and 2 destroyed. But Tejo was not finished. He gave an order to Dr. Unji, who was waiting aboard a specialized vessel positioned at the edge of the formation. Unji acknowledged the order with a single word and activated Project Hwarong. A missile launched from Unji's ship. It was small, absurdly small, compared to the weapons that had just torn apart an armada. It crossed the corridor in seconds and entered the atmosphere of an uninhabited gas giant at the edge of the system. A planet with no life, no colonies, no value to anyone. The missile detonated inside the planet's core. For a brief moment, nothing happened. Then the gas giant's surface rippled, as if something enormous had moved beneath it. The planet's color shifted from dull brown to blinding white. Its core collapsed and then ignited, and for 3 seconds, the gas giant became a star. A miniature sun blazed in the darkness, so bright that every ship in the corridor automatically dimmed its viewports. Then the new star folded inward, crushed by forces it could not sustain, and the planet imploded. Where a world had been, there was nothing but a ring of cooling debris and a fading glow. Every ship in the corridor, Council and Terran, had recorded it. Every sensor, every camera, every data log had captured the death of a planet. Tejo opened the communication channel again. That was aimed at a planet no one lives on, he said. His voice had not changed. It was the same calm, measured tone he had used for the 60-second warning. "We have more. We would prefer never to use them again. The next move is yours." He closed the channel. The surviving council commanders transmitted everything, every recording, every scan, every data point, back to the Nexus station at maximum speed. The transmissions arrived within hours. Volmari watched the footage in his private chambers. He watched the fleet surround the Armada. He watched the 11-minute battle. He watched the gas giant die. He watched it 3 times. Then he sat in the dark for a very long time. Pyrrha watched the footage in the open council chamber and wept openly, her thin body shaking. She kept saying the same thing over and over. "We should have listened. We should have listened." Thren did not watch the footage. Thren's flagship had been among the first destroyed. His name was added to the casualty list, one entry among thousands, and the council moved on without him. In her alcove, Archivist Sula sat in front of her screens and watched the planet die one more time. She saved the footage to Humanity's file, which was now the most accessed document in the Council's entire archive. She added a single note to the file. "Recommend immediate reassessment of all threat projections regarding Species 4471. Previous assessments are no longer valid. They may never have been." Then she closed her screens, sat in the dark, and waited for what came next. The message from the Galactic Council arrived at Terran Naval Command on a quiet morning. It was short. It was addressed to Ambassador Yuna and Admiral Tejo jointly. It contained no demands, no conditions, and no threats. It simply asked, in language more careful than anything the Council had ever written, whether humanity would be willing to return to the negotiating table. The word "please" appeared twice. In 300 years of Council communications, that word had never been used toward a younger species, not once. Tejo read the message on the bridge of the Guangato. He forwarded it to Yuna, without comment. Yuna read it in her quarters, where she had been drinking tea and reviewing the economic projections that showed the Council's trade networks were still falling apart. She set down her cup and typed a reply. "We will attend. Same hall, 3 weeks from today." No please, no thank you, just a time and a place. The 3 weeks passed slowly for the Council and quickly for the humans. Volmari spent the time preparing his delegation, though preparing was perhaps too strong a word. What he mostly did was try to figure out what the Council could still offer that would matter. The answer, he discovered after many sleepless nights, was very little. The Council's position of strength had been a comfortable illusion, and the humans had burned it away in 11 minutes and 1 dead planet. Several Council species did not wait for the formal talks. The Kaloni Federation sent a private diplomatic mission to Terran space, asking for a separate trade agreement. 2 smaller species followed within days, then 3 more. By the time the talks were scheduled to begin, nearly a quarter of the Council had already opened back-channel negotiations with humanity. Volmari pretended not to know about this, though of course he knew. On the day of the talks, the Grand Convocation Hall looked different. Not physically. The ceiling was still impossibly high, the seats still curved upward in their great bowl. But the hall was half empty. Delegations that had once fought for the best positions in the upper rows were simply absent, their seats dark. The ones that remained sat quietly. None of the usual chatter and posturing that had filled previous sessions. The Oshari delegation was present, but with a new representative. He was young, barely past the age of maturity for his species, chosen because every senior Oshari diplomat had either been killed at Myrian or had resigned in the days that followed. He sat in Thren's old seat and did not speak. His hands, resting on the console in front of him, were shaking. The doors at the bottom of the hall opened, and the humans walked in. Ambassador Yuna entered first, wearing the same formal attire she had worn months ago when she walked out. Behind her, Admiral Tejo moved in full dress uniform, dark fabric, sharp lines, medals on his chest that caught the light. He did not sit. He stood behind Yuna's chair, with his hands behind his back, his face showing nothing except patience. Dr. Enji sat to Yuna's right, her datapad open, her expression pleasant and calm, as if she had not recently built a weapon capable of killing planets. Captain Dowan and Sergeant Jiho flanked the entrance doors, standing at attention in combat dress. They were not there to fight. They were there to be seen. The message was clear to everyone in the hall. The diplomat would speak, but the people who would act if diplomacy failed were standing right there in the room. Yuna looked up at the half-empty amphitheater. She let the silence stretch for a moment. Then she spoke. 11 months ago, I sat at this table and listened. Today, I will talk. The council will listen. Nobody objected. Nobody interrupted. Valmari, who had spent centuries controlling the flow of conversation in this hall, simply nodded. Yuna laid out humanity's terms. She did it without raising her voice, without dramatic pauses, without any of the rhetorical games that council diplomats loved. She spoke plainly, the way a person gives directions to someone who is lost. All Terran territory would be recognized in full, including the 12 colony worlds the Council had demanded humanity surrender. The Council would withdraw all military assets from within 50 light-years of the Terran border, creating a buffer zone that would be patrolled by neither side. Humanity would receive full voting membership on the Galactic Council, effective immediately. Not in 200 years, not provisionally, but now. The Council would issue a formal statement acknowledging that the border war had been an act of unprovoked aggression against humanity. A joint investigation would be conducted into the intelligence failures that had led to the war, and its findings would be made public. Reparations for the human colonies damaged during the conflict would be negotiated separately with each affected world. Yuna finished and placed her hands flat on the table. These are our terms, she said. They are not negotiable. The hall was silent. Valmari looked at the terms displayed on his console. He read them twice. Then he asked a question, and for the first time in Yuna's experience, his voice held no authority, no command, no assumption of superiority. It was just the voice of someone who needed to know. And if the Council finds itself unable to accept these terms? Yuna did not answer. She turned her head very slightly and looked at Tejo. Tejo did not speak. He did not move. He simply stood there, hands behind his back, eyes forward. He did not need to say anything. Everyone in the room had seen the footage. Everyone knew what the next step would be. The silence lasted 5 seconds. Then, Pyrrha voted yes. Her voice cracked as she said it, but she said it. The delegation beside her voted yes. Then the next, then the next. One by one, like falling stones, the votes came in. The young Oshari delegate voted last. His hands were still shaking when he pressed the button. He did not look up. Volmari ratified the agreement. His voice was steady because he was old enough and proud enough to keep it steady. But his 6 limbs were very still. He announced that the terms were accepted unanimously, and that the formal documents would be prepared for signature within the standard period. The session ended. Delegates began to leave, moving quietly. None of the usual socializing and deal-making that followed major votes. The hall emptied slowly, like water draining from a basin. Valmari descended from his podium, something he rarely did, and walked to the human table. Yuna was still seated, organizing her documents with the same precise movements she had used the day she walked out. She looked up as Valmari approached. He stood before her, all 6 limbs folded in what was, for his species, a posture of deep respect. He spoke quietly, for her alone. Did your people always intend this outcome? Yuna considered the question. She thought about the 11 months of useless talks. She thought about the 3 months of silence. She thought about the fleet, the battle, the dead planet. She thought about the 12 colony worlds where human families had built homes and raised children, and wondered if they would have to leave. "We intended peace, High Speaker," she said. "We always intend peace. But we have learned, over thousands of years of killing each other, that peace is not given. It is established, and it is maintained not by goodwill, but by the absolute certainty that war is worse." Volmari looked at her for a long time. Then he bowed, a full bow, the kind his species reserved for equals, and walked away without another word. Yuna stood. Teho fell into step beside her. Unji, Dohwan, and Jiho followed. The Terran delegation walked out of the Grand Convocation Hall for the second time. The first time, the galaxy had watched them leave with contempt and amusement. This time, the galaxy watched with something else entirely. In her alcove, Sula was already writing. Her entry would be added to the Galactic Archive, the permanent record of every significant event in Council history. She wrote slowly, choosing each word with care, because she knew this entry would be read more than anything she had ever written. She knew because for the first time, people were paying attention. Let the record show that humanity asked for peace and were offered subjugation. They left without anger. They returned without mercy. And when it was over, they offered peace again, the same peace they had asked for from the beginning. The terms had not changed, only the galaxy's understanding of what refusing those terms would cost. She paused. She looked at her screen, at the file that had started all of this. 2,047 pages that no one had read until it was too late. She added one final line. "I have updated humanity's file. This time, I recommend the Council read it." She saved the entry and closed her console. The lights in her alcove dimmed. Outside the station, the stars burned on in silence, the same as they always had. But something in the space between them had changed. Something that would not change back. Humanity had come to the galaxy asking to be treated as equals. The galaxy had refused. Now the galaxy understood. And in the quiet corridors of the Nexus station, in the empty seats of the convocation hall, in the shaking hands of a young Oshari delegate who had inherited a seat no one wanted, that understanding settled like dust after a storm. It would not be forgotten.